Hello and welcome to today's program, a conversation regarding the late Paul Volcker's last book, Keeping at It, The Quest for Sound Money and Good Government. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Tom Byrne. I'm the president and CEO of the Korea Society. Today's program focuses on the life and legacy of Paul Volcker as outlined in his book, which has recently been published, translated into Korean. Limited copies of both the English and Korean versions of the book are available in the back of the room. Please feel free to grab one by the end of the evening. Selected by President Jimmy Carter as a reassuring and qualified nominee, Paul Volcker assumed his role as the 12th chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979, and he served until 1987. During a time, at least at the beginning, known as the Great Inflation. Inflation rate had peaked at 14.8% in March 1980. Mortgage rates soared, American consumers lost purchasing power, there was great instability. Under his leadership, the Federal Reserve Board pursued tight and aggressive monetary policies, raising the federal funds rate to a peak of 20% in June 1981. Presently, it's 5.5%. Volcker's crackdown on inflation worked. After leaving the Federal Reserve in 1987, he became chairman of the prominent New York investment banking firm, Wolfenson & Company, run by James T. Wolfenson, who later became president of the World Bank. Volcker also chaired the Economic Advisory Board under President Obama during the subprime mortgage crisis from 2009 to 2011. Here with us tonight to delve further into Paul Volcker's life and legacy are Christine Harper and Mr. William Rhodes, who will join Christine on the stage in a minute or two. Bill Rhodes is president and CEO of William R. Rhodes Global Advisors, LLC, which he founded in 2010. He most recently served as senior advisor, senior vice chairman, and senior international officer at Citigroup and chairman, president, and CEO of Citibank North America. Bill is also a long-serving director of the Korea Society's board. In 2011, he accepted the Korea Society's annual General James A. Van Fleet Award on behalf of the U.S. Korea Business Council. Bill was also awarded the Korean Diplomatic Medal by the Korean government for helping restructure the short-term cross-border debt of the Korean banks during the so-called IMF crisis, also known as the Asian financial crisis, which unfolded 25 years ago, as well as for helping advance the negotiations for the KORUS free trade agreement between South Korea and the U.S. Paul Volcker wrote the foreword to Bill's book, Banker to the World, which was published in 2011. Referencing the Latin American debt crisis in the 1980s, Volcker noted that the need for debt restructuring was no easy challenge, as global banks needed to be organized to respond cooperatively and on short notice. Volcker continues, by some serendipity, the right man appeared at the right time. Bill Rhodes, highly experienced in Latin America and a senior official at Citibank. He knew both Latin American leaders and banking colleagues. It was natural that he be called upon to lead. As such, he was the main contact point for me, meaning Paul Volcker, and the IMF. Christine Harper is a member of Bloomberg's editorial board and the co-author of the book we will be discussing this evening. She joined the editorial board in June 2023 after 5 years as editor of Bloomberg Markets magazine and 5 years helping to oversee the newsroom's global coverage of financial institutions. It's great to meet you in person, Christine, and welcome to the Korea Society. I look forward to this illuminating conversation. Before I turn it over to today's guests and speakers, I want to thank a few people. First, I'd like to thank Tom Kang, who worked with Paul Volcker at Wolfenson and Company. He has an illustrious career in education before working in the world of finance, and the foundation was set at Archbishop Malloy High School here in Queens, New York City. And we thank Tom for his generous support of the program. Next, I would like to thank Mr. Minho Nam at the Bank of Korea, who translated the book into Korean and provided the copies in the book. Unfortunately, he can't join us in person tonight, but Kim Chu-hyun, the DC rep for the Bank of Korea, and E.J. Hong, the New York City rep, are here with us tonight. Finally, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors at the Columbia Business School APEC Study Center. We will have the opportunity for audience questions towards the end of the program. I would also like to thank, I'm glad I didn't forget, Anke Volcker, who's here with us tonight, sitting in the front row. So thanks for joining us. For our in-person audience, we will be serving delicious Korean food along with wine, beer, and soft drinks following the program. So thank you for joining us tonight. And with that, over to you, Bill. You'd like to make some remarks at the podium. Okay.
Thank you very much, Tom. And it's a great honor to be here with all of you as a long-term member of the board of the Korea Society, and very pleased that Anke is here with us tonight, as well as a number of members of the Volcker Alliance. I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to first meet Paul Volcker at the beginning of the Latin American debt crisis, which started with Mexico's inability to service its high public foreign debt in 1982. And the same problem of debt was soon experienced by most of Latin America and some countries in Africa, Central Europe, and the Philippines in Asia. Since Paul was considered to be the leading central banker of his day and was in the midst of trying to slay the dragon of high inflation in the US that he inherited at the Fed, he saw very rapidly that most of the major banks worldwide, including Citibank, were highly exposed to Latin American countries, and that serving the debt would be a real increase in substantially of the Fed's responsibilities, and particularly with the rise in interest rates in trying to force down inflation. He perceived very quickly that a combination of high interest rates domestically in the US and high international bank exposure would cause a major international banking crisis, and he actually thought it could lead to a worldwide Great Recession. He decided then, based on the size of Citibank's exposure and my own personal knowledge of Latin America and my previous experience in restructuring the debt of Jamaica, Nicaragua, that I should play one of the lead roles in coordinating the banks worldwide to restructure the Latin American debt. He said he would handle the coordination of the major central banks and the Bank of International Settlements worldwide, and that he and Jacques de la Rosière, who was then head of the International Monetary Fund, which was going to have to provide the finance that was necessary to bring these countries back to the markets and restructure their debt, that we all needed to work together to resolve this problem. And it later became a joke that we were known as the Three Musketeers, Volcker, de la Rosière, and Rhodes. During the process, I often had to work closely with my boss, Walter Wriston, who was then head of Citibank and considered to be the leading banker of his day. His cooperation was necessary to resolve this problem, even though he and Paul didn't agree on a number of issues, including Paul's policy on raising interest rates to fight inflation. History proved that Paul was right, and unfortunately, Walter was wrong. I was oftentimes put in a difficult situation acting as an intermediary between the two, and the joke at the time in the financial world that I was caught between Paul Volcker, who is known as the world's tallest central banker and regulator, and Walter Wriston, the world's tallest banker. They were both over 6'4". Not only was Paul a leading central banker of his day, but also his commitment and insistence on keeping interest rates high when it was very unpopular saved the U.S. not only from hyperinflation, but many think from a worldwide Great Depression. Watching him and working with him over a number of years proved to be a great inspiration for me in my career. And I had the opportunity on many occasions to visit him down at the Fed and seek his advice and support on restructuring the debt. I would say that at the end, I was very fortunate, as some of you know, particularly Anke, to share offices with Paul before he passed away. And not only was he an example to me, but as you know, he was an inspiration and guide to the policies that are being implemented, even today by Jay Powell, who uses the term keeping at it, which is based on Paul's book in almost every major speech he gives. The most recent one was at Jackson Hole about a month ago. Paul's legacy at the Fed, combined with his dedication to public service, which is embodied in the work of the Volcker Alliance, and the members, I would say, of the Volcker Alliance, and there are several of them here today, where I'm also privileged to be on the board. Those two things, his work at the Fed and founding the Volcker Alliance, and its work towards pushing forward on public service, will be Paul's everlasting legacy. Thank you very much, and now I'm going to join Christine.
This is from Dr. Minho Nam, who translated the book into Korean. Dear Korea Society and all the sponsors and participants, when I heard that the Korea Society would celebrate the publication of Keeping at It in Korean, I felt more than happy and greatly honored. I'd like to express enormous gratitude to all the people who have prepared for this event. Although I won't be able to join you because of a family obligation, I really feel as if I am beside you writing this letter in my office. I'd like to mention two things below: my perspective on Volcker's life and unanticipated rewards I received through the translation. Volcker lived as a sheer archetype of a central banker, a public officer, and a common citizen, not by mere remarks, but by real actions. Adherence to principles, integrity, fortitude, being aloof from practical compensation, these are the virtues Volcker embodied throughout his life. Among these merits, the most impressive one is that Volcker recognized authority typically deemed to pertain to public officials as responsibility. Deplorably, it's not rare for us to observe some people in highly responsible positions behave too differently from Volcker. However, there are still numerous common people from all walks of life doing their utmost silently to fulfill their responsibilities. Today's gathering of the Korea Society also seems to me a clear evidence for the fact. So we can still remain optimistic because sensible people like you will lead our societies onward as before. Secondly, I'd like to write about serendipities I found doing the translation. The opportunity to translate Keeping at It fell on me abruptly. It was humiliating for me as a central banker to find in early 2022 that Volcker's memoir had not been translated in Korean, even over 3 years after its publication in the US. Owing to the dedicated assistance from my friends, I could fulfill the self-imposed duty of translation successfully. Although I had suffered from severe backaches for a long while since the completion of the first draft last year, Volcker compensated me for the toil with many surprise gifts. For example, reunion with my beloved American friends, ability to fully focus, intense reflection on my life, my family's happiness, and so forth. I heartily wish you reap fruitful rewards from today's discussion, and Korean participants enjoy happy Chuseok, I probably mispronounced that, sorry, Korean Thanksgiving Day, which I think is tomorrow. Many congratulations, and thank you all so much again. Sincerely yours, Minho Nam. So that was lovely. I think we all feel great about the Bank of Korea after reading that. So I want to tell just one short story about the book, because you mentioned the title, Keeping at It. Probably one of the most difficult things in the process of writing the book with Paul, who was amazing to work with, was coming up with the title. He was very, very stubborn about it. He cared a lot about words. We debated intensely how to phrase certain things. And the title, he really didn't want some pompous sounding, self-important title. And so we would come to him with different ideas, and he would shoot them all down. And then he would come up with things that were kind of jokey, about the wise old parrot speaks, which you will only understand if you read the beginning of the book. And we didn't love that. So after endless ideas going towards him, and he just would cut them off. I mean, he didn't like any of them. Finally, I was going through all these old transcripts of Fed meetings, trying to come up with a phrase that encapsulated his experience. And I said, well, what about sustained commitment? And he said, keeping at it. And I said, exactly. So he knew how to say what was something that was in Fed speak, but say it in normal language. And now if you Google the phrase keeping at it, or even keep at it, Volcker comes up. He basically owns this phrase. And of course, he's basically written a script for the current chairman of the Federal Reserve. So a genius. That said, he had very strong, I mean, one thing that was interesting to me was that I knew some elements of his life before I worked with him on the book, but I don't think I fully appreciated how one of the results of his campaign to end inflation by raising interest rates extremely high, much higher than even he thought he was going to have to, was a series of financial crises. I mean, really a lot of disasters. And there's a great chapter in the book, sort of right after the inflation fight, about all these crises, and it was remarkable. It was Continental Illinois, the Hunt brothers. I mean, one thing after another, and it seems kind of relevant today. But the big one, the one that really set everybody, back, was Latin America, and because I think the 8 biggest banks in the U.S. had loans out to these countries in Latin America that were much like a multiple of their capital. So if these countries were all defaulting, so all the big banks could go under, and so he had to basically put everything aside and focus on this, and that's where he was lucky enough to have Bill work with him. And I thought what was really great was how he said in the book, in the foreword to your book, that what sticks in my mind to this day are the relatively ineffective efforts by other bankers who were called upon from time to time to lead the financing effort for particularly countries. It was not that they lacked financial expertise. What was absent was an instinctive understanding of the varied interest at stake, the ability to marshal a consensus, and when needed, the will to exert authority. Those were the qualities that Bill brought to the table. So you're not a typical banker, is what he was saying. A lot of bankers couldn't do what you did.
Well, I was very lucky because I had an inspiration from Paul, and he basically did not use the term keep at it, but he said, I'm counting on you to work with me, and Jacques de la Rosière ran the International Monetary Fund, who were 2 of the real examples of my life. Paul more than anything else, because as you know, I had the opportunity, thanks to Anka, to pass the last couple of years of his life when he was in the office working with him. And I often saw you coming in, and sometimes he would pass drafts to me of what you had written and say, what do you think?
Yeah, no, it was a great experience. I mean, it wasn't far from here, just at Rockefeller Center where his office was, and it was he was so dedicated. He had such powers of concentration, and he would just sit there and focus on each chapter, and I would work with him on the wording, and then you were right down the hall, and you had written your own book, so I think that helped inspire him as well. So just a couple questions before we go to audience questions, which I hope there'll be many. When you first met Paul, what was that like? I mean, you were a banker at Citibank. You spent your whole career in the private sector, and he was the chairman of the Federal Reserve. He'd been the assistant secretary of the Treasury. He was sort of a legendary figure. He'd been New York Fed president. Do you have any memories of what that was like?
I remember very well that first time coming into his office, and of course for me it was quite a moment, because here I was with the chairman of the Fed, Tall Paul as they called him.
Right.
And one of the things we had in common, which you look back on today, was unfortunately a cigar smoker, but he always had the cheap cigars and he kept the good ones on the side. And he said, Rhodes, I understand that you're a cigar smoker. So he said, I keep the good ones on the side, so have a cigar. But he made it very plain that he felt we were on the verge of an international financial crisis. And this is where he and Walter Wriston disagreed. And so it put me in a difficult position. But he told me, he said, Bill, I'm always going to be there with you. And I must say for Walter said, look, we disagree, because Walter actually wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal blaming Paul for the Latin American debt crisis by saying countries don't go broke. And of course, the joke that I put out was countries don't go broke, just the banks that lend to them, and which turned out, unfortunately, be the case. And so I had his constant support and was down there at least once a month talking with him and with Jacques de la Rosière, who is his partner in all of this. And I think, in fact, we did, with Paul's leadership, really keep the world from an international financial crisis.
No doubt.
But
yeah.
he had to move ahead with interest rates because otherwise we would have gone into a Great Depression.
Right.
And one of the things that was mentioned here was Jimmy Carter, God bless his soul, because Jimmy Carter was one who gave him his full backing. And Paul told me, and you have it in the book, that when he took over the job, Paul said, well, this may cause you problems with your reelection and everything, if I can remember more or less the words. And Jimmy Carter said, well, you let me handle the politics, you just handle the economics. And so I think, fortunately for this country and for the world, we had two great men, because I think Jimmy Carter was a great president. And obviously, I think Paul was the greatest head of the Federal Reserve since it was founded in 1914. At a crucial moment, not only for inflation, but to handle these international crises which came up.
Yeah. So he's quite scathing about Walter Wriston in the book and about Walter's view that, banks don't need to hold any capital against loans to countries because they'll never, and I do think that he had quite a view of bankers after some of those experiences, and that I think that informed some of his views on financial regulation going forward. And Tony Dowd in the audience knows a lot more about that than I do, but because he worked with him during the Obama years. But did you ever, having the skill set that you had of being able to work with the public sector and the private sector, were you ever tempted to go into the public sector and sort of follow his lead? I mean, I'm just sort of curious because you spent your whole career unusually at one institution.
Yes, and I had several offers to go, and I look back and regret under 3 administrations to go down in one role or another to Washington. And, I feel badly because I let Paul down because of the public service side of it.
Right.
But one of the other things I think we ought to mention is that when we look at Dodd-Frank regulation, one of the people that really was behind that and drove that was Paul.
Right, yeah.
Because of this experience
exactly.
of that you mentioned of the capitalization and, the loan portfolios and everything. And unfortunately, a lot of those rules were rolled back. And we can see what the result was with the problems we've had most recently with some of the regional banks because they weren't put under the same regulatory umbrella that they should have been. So at the end, Paul, I think, turned out right again. I think he would have been a little bit disappointed in Barney Frank, who kind of changed his tune, because I used to see Barney Frank come into the office too.
Yeah.
Because he was on the board of one of the banks that got into trouble and was arguing that they didn't need the same capital. So one of the things about Paul, apart from everything that we've said, is that he believed that you had to have regulation, smart regulation, but regulation that was fully implemented. And one of the problems you've had with some of the Fed heads and those who worked in the Federal Reserve is that they let the whole regulatory side go.
Right.
And of course, the bankers always wanted that because they wanted a free hand.
Well, he used to tell me that it was very difficult to be turning the screws on monetary policy, which doesn't make most people happy, and being tough on regulation, that you could kind of do one or the other, and so they were tough on raising rates, and then they had to deal with the fallout. And I think that's why he became so insistent that you had to regulate correctly, because it limits your ability to be tough on monetary policy if the banks are collapsing, obviously. I mean,
right, and I think his view on the regulatory side of the Fed is very, very important. And we've had Fed heads, as I've said, who have not really looked at that side of it. So I think Paul set the mantra for what a central banker should be. And I was very happy to see that Jay Powell not only is following more or less those ideas, but as I mentioned, he quotes from basically from that book all the time, most
does,
recently
yeah.
in Jackson Hole.
Yeah, no, and he's recommended it several times, and you know who else has Warren Buffett. So
Right.
he's got
Well,
a
I
lot of fans.
understand that personally, I don't know this for a case, that he actually bought 400 copies and handed them out.
Yeah, I've heard that too. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that's so important, and the reason that Paul wrote the book, of course, is, you know, he wanted to tell some of these stories, but a lot of them had been told in other biographies, but he really wanted to emphasize the importance of effective public servants, right? I mean, people who can get the job done and do it well and really, you know, provide a government that works. And I think we've all seen that, you know, there's examples of it today that not having that is a real problem. And I think that's that message is something that can fit in any country. That's why I think he'd be delighted that the book is being translated into a lot of other languages, because he spent a lot of time around the world at the Treasury, at the Fed. I mean, he really cared about international monetary system and about making sure that financial institutions, you know, around the world work together. So I think he would have been very glad that the points he's making about public service
Well, that's why
are resonating elsewhere.
Yeah, Christine, that's why he founded the Volcker Alliance.
Of
And we have
course.
several members of the board
Yeah.
actually sitting out here in the
Yeah.
Volcker Alliance. And so I think that that's one of the mandates, the major mandate of the Volcker Alliance
Right.
is to push public service.
Right.
And I think they're doing a very good job
Absolutely.
at it.
Yeah. One final question before I open it up. So you had this experience that we just talked about working with him on Latin America, but then after he left the Fed, you had to then bring some of those lessons to Korea.
That's right, because as most of you know, Korea went through this tremendous debt crisis in the late 10 years after, let's say, the Latin American debt crisis
1990s,
was
yeah.
over. Yeah. And Kim Dae-jung came in as president. And a lot of people were concerned because of his left-wing background, socialist background, that he wouldn't want to work with the International Monetary Fund. And so I had been approached by his ministers to see if I would head up a banking group similar to what I had done in Latin America. And I said I wouldn't do it unless he personally gave me blessing. So I got on an airplane, something I learned you had to do then, and went to see him right after his inauguration. And I said, can I count on you, Mr. President, to give you my support? And although he's a controversial figure in Korean history, he said, you've got my support. And with that, I was able to get the banks together, because the major holders of the debt weren't American banks on this particular occasion. They were Japanese banks. And I'd gotten to work with the Japanese banks during the Asian financial crisis, before the Asian financial crisis with the Latin American debt crisis. And I had to call each one separately, the head of all the banks, starting with Tokyo Mitsubishi, which was then the largest bank in Japan, and at one point the largest bank in the world. And I started working down the list over the Christmas holidays, and got each one of them to agree to roll over their debt if I would guarantee that the American banks and the European banks would roll over their debt. And so I got on to the head of Willie Purvis, who was running Hong Kong Shanghai Bank at the time, and said, Willie, would you support me? And he said, Bill, I'm going to convene a meeting in London, and you got my support. So with all of that, we were able to put this together in 3 months' time, which was a record for any restructuring. But I have to say, when a Korean gives his word or her word, they really mean it. And I think that the Korean restructuring set an example for that anywhere in the world, because they wanted to make sure with their pride that if they said they were going to do something, they did it. And within 3 months afterwards, they were able to go to the markets, which was just incredible,
Wow.
and raise several $1 billion.
Wow. Okay. Well, on that note, I think both Bill and I would be happy to discuss the book, discuss Paul Volcker, discuss anything that you might want to know about. So right there.
Including Korea, if you want to ask
Yes,
any questions
obviously.
about Korea.
Obviously,
Because I made a
we're
lot
here.
of trips to Korea.
I know very little about Korea, so I won't. Don't ask me.
Thank you very much. Paul Sheard. This is a fantastic book. In fact, I was so keen to read the book when it came out that unbeknownst to myself, I ordered 2 copies. I only read one. My question picks up on Christine's second last point, that we could talk all night about monetary policy and Paul Volcker's contributions. I do agree with Bill. I mean, I think the central banker of the century. And of course, let's not forget his role in the Nixon administration when he was at the Treasury, taking the US, changing the Bretton Woods system, his role in the 3 days at Camp David, as Jeff Garten put it. But I want to pick up on the second last point of Christine's. The second part of the subtitle about the quest for good government. And, when I read the book, as a sort of central bank watching type, I was kind of surprised that the central theme that came out, to me at least, was this lament about the way in which public service had really deteriorated, and the number of people that really were devoting their lives to public service was becoming less and less, fewer and fewer, and maybe Paul was the last great one. So I wanted to ask you, both of you, about your thoughts about that. Is the Volcker view of public service something that's gone in the past? Can it be revived? What do we need to do and think collectively to make that happen? What would he be thinking sitting here, and what would his advice be to aspiring younger public servants, people who wanted to make a contribution to public service?
Well, I mean, as Bill said, the Volcker Alliance is leading the way on trying to make sure that for those younger people who do want to go into public service, that they get the tools that they need to be able to be effective. Because the way he put it to me once was, he found it kind of upsetting that you can get an MBA if you want to go into business. You can get a law degree if you want to be a lawyer. Medical degree if you want to be a doctor. But there's nothing to become a public servant, and very it's sort of a vague So he wanted to make sure that people are adequately trained, and the book, I think, is a sort of description of what your career can be, at best case. I mean, he was amazing, he's sort of the iconic version, but if you are that type of public servant, I mean, he was so well qualified for every job he went into, and he was the perfect person at that time for each job. And so he was incredibly effective, and he was, changed every American's lives. So I think, on your question about whether he would feel that's happening now, I mean, I think he would be encouraged, I'm sure, by what the Volcker Alliance is doing. I'm sure there are ways in which he would be discouraged by some of what he's seeing in the government today, but he was pretty optimistic in many respects. I mean, he didn't let himself get easily discouraged. Anka may disagree, but I thought he always sort of wanted. I mean, keeping at it is a classic. Like he never wanted to give up the fight, right? So he might not have been pleased with everything he's seeing. I mean, look, the government's about to shut down, right? But like and he also liked to divorce like politics and policy from just the people trying to get the stuff done, right? So, politicians could set policy, but whatever was decided, they needed good people to get it to work, and that's what he wanted to make sure happened.
I think I would just add to that I think he would be pleased, although it was tough to always please Paul, but I think he would be pleased to see how Jay Powell is handling the situation. I really do. And also how he takes that thought of keeping at it. And I think he said, Jay Powell, on many occasions, that Paul has been his inspiration. And I think we need that in Washington today when we have such a fractured government. At least you need some solid area of our, if you want to call it, infrastructure in the United States. And I think he provides that. Wouldn't you say, Christine?
Yeah, and I think, one of the things he told me during because we were meeting a lot before Powell was chosen and after Powell had been chosen, and he he liked Powell as a choice because he had that experience working in Treasury, working in the private sector. He wasn't just some academic economist. Paul felt strongly that there were too many academic economists and not enough people who really knew, and like Paul had worked at Chase, he'd worked at, Treasury. So I think he would appreciate that about at least Jay Powell. I can't speak to the rest of the government, though.
I think there was another aspect of Paul which people often forget. He ran the New York Fed before he took the Federal Reserve position in Washington. And the New York Fed is the part of the Federal Reserve System that runs the international. And of course, as you mentioned, his work at Chase, et cetera. So there are very few people that I can think of, nobody else, that stepped into that job at the Fed who had Paul's experience. And as you say, one of the good things about Jay Powell is he also had come from the private sector and did have that side of it. And you take a look at so many of the Fed heads, and they really have not had that experience.
No, he valued the experience he'd had even early in his career on the New York Fed's trading floor, getting to see how sort of monetary policy actually worked through the open market, operations. So please.
My name is Joel Silverman, and I had the pleasure of, or the honor of, going to the LSE as well after Paul, Mr. Volcker, I should say. And I have one question and then one comment. I also lived in Korea, and so that goes to my second question. But the first question I have for you is, I'm sorry, I have not read the book. And so I'm not sure whether this is already covered there, and if it is, then you don't have to. But I would be interested in knowing how Mr. Volcker felt about cryptocurrency and the way that it has basically been allowed to.
I will tell you. So when I was working with him on the book, cryptocurrency was getting talked about, but it hadn't quite really taken off, And I remember a few times he had people come to his office to talk to him about it, and he would sort of emerge from these meetings with this puzzled expression. And he had basically two reactions. One was he was glad he didn't really have to know about it. But two, which I thought was and I love to almost quote this about him sometimes because he was so perceptive. He was like, let me get it straight. What you own is something on somebody else's computer.
Yeah.
And, I know you could say that's true of the banking system now too, but like he was very good at kind of getting to the essence. So I don't think he was too persuaded by it. But also he didn't completely, he was open to more ideas than you sometimes, like I remember once asking him about modern monetary theory, which is kind of the view that the government can spend as much as it wants and as long as it, doesn't cause inflation. And I thought, oh, he's going to hate this, but he was like, well, it hasn't been tried. So he was not as easy to guess what he would think about things.
Another thing I would just add, which I didn't in my comments, is that Paul was very interested in what was going on with the restructuring of Korea. And I would brief him on a regular basis. And for that period of time, some of you may remember, and I mentioned the pride of the Korean people, the women in Korea were actually melting down their gold jewelry so the country wouldn't go into default. Now, I've never seen anything like that in my life. Certainly nothing in Latin America, Africa, or Central Europe to compare with that. And so I think Paul had an interest in Korea going way back. And he made numerous trips there also. So.
The second point, and I don't mean this to embarrass anyone, but I'm intrigued by, and I wonder why the translator has the book's name in Korean is Mr. Chairman. Okay?
Oh, interesting.
So it's How that relates to keeping at it, I don't know. But
Well, it's funny. That's one of the titles that we kind of were trying to get him to agree to, but he liked keeping at it better. So maybe they thought Mr. Chairman would work better in Korean. I don't know.
Well, I think that, in my work with the U.S. Korea Business Council, I was chair for a number of years, you always referred to the head of the chaebol or the head of any business as chairman. And I know my book was translated into Korea by Samsung, and I was referred to in that book as Mr. Chairman. So, because I was chairman of Citibank at the time. So I think that may answer part of that.
Interesting.
Paul Walker was succeeded by Alan Greenspan. Was he happy with his successor? And what was his attitude towards the statement of Mr. Greenspan with peculiar meaning, like nobody understands what he's talking about?
Well, Paul writes a little bit in the book about Greenspan, and I think he was happy that inflation remained under control, that didn't change. But yeah, I'll let you read the rest in the book.
I think you want to put it this way, that he agreed on a number of things and disagreed on a number of things, particularly on the regulatory side with Alan Greenspan. I think, put it this way, if Paul had been in the job at the time, I think he would have handled things differently. Just a personal opinion.
But in terms, I mean, you're asking about the way that Alan Greenspan communicated? Well, he didn't weigh in on that particularly, but obviously Paul had a different style of communicating. Right. But I'll tell you something that's interesting. I mean, if you read some of the minutes of Paul's Fed meetings, which are all available online, and you can read Paul talking to his fellow board members, and they're discussing how to phrase these communiques, because that was, in those days, they didn't come out and say, here's what the interest rate. They sort of guided people with these, interestingly phrased, communiques. They were very careful. I mean, they said things very precisely, and so I think Paul was very plain spoken if you met him in person, but I think he also respected the need to be very careful in how you communicate as a Fed official.
But I think another major difference was on the regulatory side, because Alan Greenspan was more of a free market type person, as you know, and believed that a lot of the regulation of the banking system was not really that necessary, and the bank should be more freed up. I mean, example, Walter Wriston was a big fan of Alan Greenspan, and as we've said, he didn't agree with Paul on a number of issues, and one of them was regulation.
Yeah, Paul very much believed government had an important role to play, and I think that was less of a Alan Greenspan.
Yeah, and I think the most recent events that we've seen with the bank failures in a number of cases really has shown that Paul was right, that you have to keep minimal capital ratios. You can't let it down, and you have to have sufficient regulation. And the Fed has to take seriously its role as chief regulator.
Yeah.
That may sound surprising coming from a commercial banker, but you learn the hard way on these things.
I mean, Paul himself had experience as a commercial banker.
Right, at Chase.
Yeah.
He used to travel around with David Rockefeller around the world.
Right. Oh, here's a nope. I think.
Yeah, Mike over here.
Hi, thank you. This is very informative, and it's just great to listen to Christine talk about the mechanics of how the book came together. I'm curious, I did meet Mr. Volcker on 2 separate occasions, and he didn't seem to want to talk about policy and everything like that. It was a social setting. I'm wondering if he were around today, what would his bird's eye view be of the current inflation and rate situation, and essentially the dilemma that Jay Powell is facing.
What do you think?
Well, I think, as we both said, I think he would be very supportive of the policies that Jay Powell is implementing, which really is keeping at it. And that's why I think Jay Powell is facing a lot of pressure to stop raising interest rates. But I think he looks back to the Volcker era and realizes that if you ease up too much, then you're going to face a situation that's more difficult afterwards. So, my humble opinion, I think he'd be very supportive of what Jay Powell is doing today.
I think he'd be very critical of the beginning of Jay Powell's term, though.
But not now.
Well, I think he'd be glad that they're getting it under control, but I think he would be very critical of that it was allowed to get to the point it got to, and that there were changes in the Fed's focus a little bit away from
Particularly on the
price signal.
regulatory side.
Well, on the regulatory side, but also on just sort of like trying to worry about elements of, the economy that he might not have thought were under the Fed's.
But I think on the regulatory side, I think Jay Powell admits also
Yeah.
it's very difficult
Yeah.
to get someone to admit it, that they eased up too much.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I mean, thank you, Anka. I mean, Paul, we talked a lot about his concern about the fact that people had lost trust in government. Then poll after poll shows this, and he mentions this in the book and how horrible it's become. And I actually remember one time talking to him about it. People just need to trust government. And he was like, no, because governments can do really bad things. So you don't just want to trust government, but government needs to earn that trust by performing effectively for the people. And, the great thing I didn't know at all about Paul and kind of insisted went into the book was the story of his father, which was his father became a city manager in a sort of an era when all the local governments were horrendously corrupt in America. And so a few cities started adopting this nonpartisan, non-political city manager, somebody who would just come in and basically be chief executive of the city and just get things done. And Paul's father was an engineer and was one of the first city managers in New Jersey, I think the first, and was incredibly effective at just getting, I just think the garbage got, dealt with, and the budget got fixed, and he was like a chief, executive who got, results. And that was the inspiration for Paul. I mean, just being able to go in and get results for the American people. And that's what he did as Fed chairman and at the Treasury. And he saw lots of people around him doing things that maybe didn't agree with, but he managed to figure out how to be effective. And Bill was able to, be effective working with Paul and helping all the banks and Latin American countries get together. But that kind of results is what makes people trust government. That was his point. You're not going to get that otherwise. And I think that's a message that nobody can deny and that has to keep being repeated. You might not hear that enough on stage at another event tonight, but it's really important.
Well, I think that's something that the Volcker Alliance is trying to really push, this whole idea of public service, and that if you don't have the incentive to go into public service, you're not going to get the best people.
Right.
And you want to get your best and your brightest into public service.
Yeah, I mean, Paul could have gone to any number of high-paying jobs on Wall Street. He got offers from all the top firms over and over, offering him tons of money. And, he did work for Wolfenson and he worked for Chase, but what really mattered to him was the other jobs that he did. So I hope that everybody who reads the book gets inspired or inspires other people, because that's definitely what he would want. Okay, so one more, okay. I know Bill has to get going to something, so.
Hi,
Emily.
Emily Chase, and I had the great pleasure of sitting next to Christine at Bloomberg while she was finishing this book. But quick question for you. I know one of Paul's famous quotes is the great pinnacle of financial innovation was the ATM. And I wonder what he would think now with how fast we've seen things happen with the regional banking crisis and how quickly people were able to move deposits. Like, how would he think about the speed of finance today?
Wow. I mean, I think he would see that a lot has to change in how the Fed regulates, and how it prepares, to deal with that change in financial technology. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard. I mean, I'll honestly say that even though I'm saying things that I think Paul might say, he was constantly surprising me. So I will hedge myself and say maybe you'd say something totally different. But do you have a thought? I mean, you were sitting in the office with him all the time, so.
Well, I think he was really very open-minded on things.
Yeah.
He wanted to get to the bottom of what made things really work and what
True.
and what was necessary and what was not. And he was so, I think, so really strongly motivated by the idea of public service. And what did concern him most was he felt that that the whole idea of public service had become corrupted, and that people really weren't interested in it anymore. So I think the Volcker Alliance will be his, along with having slayed inflation, will be his great legacy, apart from being the greatest head of the Fed that we've seen. And so I think that work that's being carried on by several members of the board here, I think is really key. And he would be happy, I think, Anka, if he could come down and see the work of the Volcker Alliance at this particular point in time.
I agree. Yeah. And I think that's important what you say. I mean, he was not anti progress. He was very open-minded and very curious and always wanted to know about new things. So I think I think there were lots of things in technology he would support, but I think you'd be alarmed that things got out of control the way they did. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
For the translation and also for joining us tonight. And lastly, if you want to learn more or hear more about the Asia financial crisis, or what the Koreans call the Asia financial crisis, in October, what day is that, Chelsea? On October 18th, we'll have the honor of having former Minister Jung Duck-gu, who, along with Barry Eichengreen, wrote the comprehensive book on the Korean financial crisis. So he's doing a program talking about looking back and also looking forward, and talking about the role of China in global finance today. So hopefully you can join us again in October. Thanks again, Bill.
Thank you.
And Christine.